The Beatles played their final concert on August 29, 1966, in front of 25,000 people at Candlestick Park, San Francisco. It lasted 33 minutes. When the last note faded and the crowd was still screaming, Ringo Starr slipped off the stage and walked into John Lennon's dressing room to find something that stopped him cold. No one else had seen it. No one else was supposed to. And for years, the full weight of that moment, what it meant for the band, for the music, for the man sitting alone in that room with a notebook open on the table beside him, remained quietly buried beneath the noise of everything that came after. The summer of 1966 had been the strangest of John Lennon's life. Earlier that year, an interview he had given in London, one that had been intended as a thoughtful, wide-ranging conversation about culture and religion among young people in Britain, was reprinted in an American teen magazine under a headline that sent shockwaves across the United States. His words, stripped of the context in which they had been spoken, landed in front of an audience that had no knowledge of the original conversation and very little patience for nuance. Radio stations across the American South organized public burnings of Beatles records. Death threats arrived at venues before the band did. In the Philippines, a misunderstood snub involving the country's first lady had nearly ended in something far worse than a bad headline. By the time the North American leg of the 1966 tour began, John Lennon was no longer the carefree, quick-witted face of Beatlemania. He was a man carrying something heavy, something the screaming crowds outside every stadium could not see and would not have understood if they could. Candlestick Park that August night was ringed with security unlike anything the band had encountered before. There were plainclothes officers in the stands. The stage perimeter had been reinforced. The Beatles arrived in an armored vehicle. It was a level of precaution that would have seemed unimaginable just 3 years earlier, when the only concern was whether the girls in the front rows might collapse from the pressure of their own excitement. The band had arrived at a quiet, unspoken agreement, one that none of them had ever stated plainly, but that all four understood, that this would be the last time. George Harrison had been the most direct about it with Brian Epstein, telling him clearly that he would not be touring again after this. Ringo had grown noticeably quieter as the concert dates accumulated. Paul had channeled everything into simply getting through each show in one piece. And John Lennon had grown very still, not the stillness of peace or contentment, the stillness of a man who has already decided something large and is simply waiting for the rest of the world to arrive at the same conclusion. The performance lasted 33 minutes and was, by most accounts, nearly impossible for the band to hear themselves play. The sound equipment at Candlestick Park had not been designed for concerts of this kind or this scale. The crowd noise, 25,000 voices, sustained and continuous, at a pitch that made the air inside the open stadium feel pressurized, swallowed everything the amplifiers were putting out. The Beatles moved through the set list on muscle memory alone. John Lennon's fingers found the chord shapes because they had found those same shapes thousands of times before, not because anything he was playing was audible to him. He sang without knowing how he sounded. Somewhere in the middle of the set, a photographer working the side of the stage captured an image of John that would later become one of the most studied photographs from that entire era, not because of anything dramatic within the frame, but because of the quality of John Lennon's expression. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at the stage. He was looking at something no one else in that stadium could locate. When the final song ended, security moved before the sound had fully faded. The Beatles were pulled from the stage through a service exit corridor, while the crowd was still on its feet. Outside, 25,000 people who had waited months for those 33 minutes were not ready to let the night end. Inside, the four men who had just performed what would turn out to be their last concert as a live act moved through narrow concrete hallways towards separate dressing rooms in near silence. The noise from the stadium pressed through the walls in a low, undifferentiated roar. Ringo Starr would describe the feeling of that backstage corridor later as something like being underwater. Sound everywhere, but none of it articulate, none of it containing anything he needed to hear. He sat in his own room for a few minutes. He changed slowly. He reached for the feeling he usually found after a show. The release, the relief, the low hum of adrenaline that followed every performance. He found something quieter instead. And, almost without deciding to, he stood up and walked down the hallway. The door to John Lennon's dressing room was open a few inches. Ringo Starr pushed it wider and stepped inside without knocking. He had no particular purpose, no message to deliver, No conversation he had planned. He had simply moved in the direction of the person he had known longest in the band, the one whose silences he had learned to read over a decade of airports and hotel corridors and long nights in small rooms on foreign continents. What he found was a space that felt strangely still. John was sitting in a folding chair at the center of the room, still in his stage jacket, unmoving. The overhead fluorescent lighting was flat and harsh. On the small table beside him there was a notebook, the dark-covered, well-worn notebook that Ringo had seen John carry for years through departure lounges and tour bus aisles and hotel lobbies at 2 a.m. The notebook was open to a page of dense, slanted handwriting. John Lennon was not reading it. He was looking at the far wall of the room, at nothing in particular, with the settled expression of a man who has just finished something that needed finishing. Ringo did not cross the room. He stood near the door and let his eyes move to the open page of the notebook, in the way eyes move to any visible handwriting in a quiet room, not deliberately, but inevitably. What he saw was not a song, not a lyric, not a chord diagram, not the abbreviated shorthand that songwriters use to keep an idea from disappearing before they can return to it. It was a statement, direct, complete, written in the plain language of a man setting something down on paper in order to make it real to himself, not for anyone else to read, but for himself alone. Ringo read the opening lines and stopped. He would not repeat the full content of what was on that page, not in any interview he would give in the decades that followed. What he has said, returning to this moment in different ways across many years of being asked about it, is that the words told him John Lennon had already made his peace with what was ending, quietly, completely, and without waiting for anyone else in the band to arrive at the same understanding. John Lennon looked up. He did not appear startled. He had the quality in certain moments of a person who experiences events slightly before they happen, who has already had time to decide how to receive what is coming. He looked at Ringo with an expression that was not embarrassment, not an invitation to discuss, and not the quick deflecting humor he used to move conversations away from territory he did not want to enter. It was something more unguarded, something that said, "You have seen it, and I am not going to pretend you haven't." Ringo sat down on the bench along the wall. He did not make a joke. He did not find something lighter to say. He understood, in the particular way that old friends understand things without being told, that the right response to that room in that moment was simply to be present, to sit inside the weight of what was there without trying to reduce it into something more manageable. The two men sat together under the flat fluorescent light, while the crowd outside the stadium walls went on calling a name that both of them knew would mean something different from this night forward. They talked eventually. Not about the notebook, not about the decision that the notebook represented, or the years it would take for that decision to become visible to the rest of the world. They talked, Ringo would later say, the way people talk when they are using words to sit alongside something they are not yet ready to name. They talked about the show, about the noise that had made it impossible to hear anything, about the moment in the third song when the monitor mix had dropped out entirely, and all four of them had simply continued playing into silence. Somewhere in the conversation, one of them observed that it had been a very long tour. The other agreed. The words were ordinary, the kind that pass between people who have spent years in each other's company and no longer need language to do its heaviest work. John reached over at some point and closed the notebook. Not quickly, not defensively, simply the way a person closes something they have finished. He set it on the edge of the table, and neither of them mentioned it again. In the months that followed the final concert, John Lennon began to change in ways that were visible to everyone around him. He accepted a role in a film, a Richard Lester picture shot on location in Spain. That gave him weeks away from the band for the first time since he was a teenager playing late sets in Hamburg clubs. He grew his hair longer. He acquired the round wire-rimmed glasses that would become permanently inseparable from his face for the rest of his life. He wrote music alone, without a touring schedule compressing every idea, and without the constant pressure of a group dynamic shaping every decision. Brian Epstein raised the question of new concert dates more than once. John's response was always quiet and always the same. Not angry, not elaborated, simply final. The way a response is final when the person giving it has already done the work of the decision somewhere private and is not interested in doing it again in front of an audience. Whatever he had written in that notebook at Candlestick Park, he had written it knowing he would not be going back. The music that followed the end of touring was unlike anything the band had produced before. Sergeant, Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was built in a studio by 4 men who no longer had to ask themselves whether what they were making could be reproduced on a stage in front of a stadium crowd. The creative space that opened when the concert stopped was enormous, disorienting at first, then gradually, unmistakably, one of the most productive periods in the history of popular music. John Lennon's writing changed noticeably. The songs became more interior, more willing to remain inside a feeling rather than push toward resolution, more interested in the texture of an experience than in whether that texture would translate across a distance of 200 feet in an open-air stadium. He had always been the most restless and the sharpest writer in the room. But the man who closed that notebook and walked out of Candlestick Park wrote, from that point forward, with a different kind of permission, as though he had stopped asking himself whether what he was making needed to be held by 25,000 people at once. Ringo Starr has returned to that night over many years, in fragments, a detail here, a memory there, the full shape of the story never assembled in one place at one time. It is the kind of story that seems to need distance, and perhaps always will. What he has said consistently, across different interviews and different decades, is that he walked into that dressing room expecting one version of John Lennon and found another, and that the distance between those two versions told him more about who John actually was than almost anything else in all the years they spent together. John Lennon did not make provisional decisions. When he chose a direction, he chose it in full, and he had a way of arriving at those choices long before he announced them to anyone. The room at Candlestick Park was not where the decision was made. It was simply where it had been written down, and by the time Ringo pushed open that door, the writing was already finished. John Lennon lived 14 more years after that August night in San Francisco. He made music that still reaches people who were not alive when he recorded it. He became something larger than a rock musician, a voice, a presence, a figure whose image has outlasted the century that produced him. The people who knew him best have said, in different ways and at different times, that the essential decisions of his life were usually made before anyone else knew he was making them, quietly, privately, and alone in a room, with something in his hands that he was not yet ready to show the world. In a folding chair, in a concrete dressing room, with a notebook open on the table beside him, while 25,000 people outside were still calling his name. If this story stayed with you, there are more. The history of John Lennon's full of moments like this one, quiet, private, known only to the people who were in the room, and rarely told in full. This channel exists to find those moments and give them the space they deserve. If you want to be here for the next one, subscribe and click the bell. Leave a comment below with the moment in John Lennon's life you have always wanted someone to look into. And if someone in your life grew up with this music, someone who still knows every word, share this with them. Some stories are made to travel.